All right, so welcome back. We are going to talk in this lecture about what's called the ontological argument for the existence of God. This is the second lecture of Module 2 of Philosophy 101 on the ontological and cosmological arguments. This is going to be an argument for classical theism, namely the view that there is a God as defined by classical theism, which is we talked about in the last lecture. The argument that we're going to be looking at today in this lecture is given as your shortest reading, which is just about a half of a page of an excerpt from a book by a dude named Anselm of Canterbury, who was a monk who worked in the 11th century, and is the person who came up with this argument. This is definitely what he's most famous for. It's one of the most famous arguments in the history of philosophy. It's a fascinating argument, very difficult to get your mind around. Once you do, you'll be like, wow, that's wow. It's a thing of beauty. Very few people think that the argument is actually successful in proving the existence of God, but there's very little consensus about where it goes wrong, if it does go wrong. So it's a fun place to start doing philosophy. Now, if you have actually read the text, which you should have done before you watch this lecture, you might be like, I don't know what the hell is going on here. This is utterly baffling, totally confusing. I have no clue what this dude is talking about. And that's fine. This is a really hard argument to extract from the text. I'm going to try to explain it to you in this lecture. But just rest assured, not every reading will be like this one. Many of them will be longer, but not many of them will be this difficult. Nonetheless, it's important to try to figure it out on your own because, you're an independent person with a mind that needs to be exercised. So I want you to take a look at it before you watch the lecture and see what you can get without my help. But having said all of that, I'm going to try to guide you through the argument and help you to understand what Anselm thinks is the reason for believing that God exists. One important concept that we haven't talked about yet is that Anselm means this argument. So this argument is supposed to be a demonstrative argument. It's supposed to be a proof of God's existence. It's also supposed to be what philosophers nowadays call a priori. You may have heard that term before. It comes from Latin. It literally means prior to experience. But in this context, what it means is this is an argument. It's not supposed to rely on any evidence that you get from like the senses or science or observation or anything like that. What Anselm thinks is that this argument enables you to figure out, to prove that God exists purely through thought, reason, and reflection and logic. You can just sit down, you can think through this argument, and you can prove on the basis of just this rational this set of rational reflections that God must exist. None of it depends upon something that you can see out there in the world, any knowledge that you gain through experience. It's supposed to be something that you can prove through logic and reason alone. Which, if it's successful, then wow, that's pretty amazing. You can prove the existence of a supernatural being simply by thinking about a complicated argument that some monk came up with 1,000 years ago. But if it's so. You can tell probably from the tone of my voice that I'm not successful, that I'm not optimistic that it is actually successful in that way. But nonetheless, that's what it's aiming to do. So it's an a priori argument that's meant to be a proof of the existence of God. So before we get into the specifics of the argument, it's important to understand two really crucial ideas that are at work in the background. So here's the first, is that Anselm thinks of God as the greatest being that you can possibly think of. And this fits really well with the definition of God that we talked about in the last lecture as a perfect, absolutely perfect person. God is, as Anselm puts it, that than which nothing greater can be thought. Right. So it's like, think of the best thing that you can think of. The very, very, very best thing that you can think of is God. If you think you've got an idea of God, but then you're like, oh, well, I can think of something a little bit better, then actually that first thing was not your idea of God. The second thing might be, but if you can think of something even better than that, then that's your idea of God. So God is the absolutely the greatest, most perfect, best being that you can possibly think of. So that's the first essential idea for Anselm. And the second really important idea for him is that we can distinguish between two different ways that something can exist. Something can exist in what Anselm calls in the understanding, or it can exist, as he says, in reality. And the idea of existence in reality is not very complicated. It's just, like existence. So like, my shirt is, here it is, my car is in the driveway. I see some trees and stuff outside. Those things all exist in reality. They're out there. Existence in the understanding, it also makes some intuitive sense once you have it explained to you, although it's a bit of a stranger way of thinking. To say that something exists in the understanding is simply to say that you can think of it. So think of a unicorn. Got it? According to Anselm, if you can think of a unicorn, then a unicorn exists in your understanding. Namely, it's sort of up here in your head. That doesn't mean that it exists in reality. It's very different. I mean, there are no real unicorns, at least not as far as we know. But there are unicorns that exist in the understanding, namely the ones that I'm thinking, the ones that you and I are thinking of right now. Okay, so some things Anselm thinks exist only in the understanding, unicorns, for example. But other things exist both in the understanding and in reality. Those are things that, that are really out there, but that I can think of. So, the tree across the street that I can see right now, that exists in my understanding. I'm thinking of it right now. It also exists in reality, like it's really over there. I could go over and I could touch it. It's part of the real world. In the discussion of this argument in your textbook, there's a nice series of Venn diagrams that helps to explain this concept of existence in the understanding, which might be helpful to you. I don't know. You might want to take a look at that. It's important to see, too, that there could be things that exist in reality but not in the understanding. These might be things that are, things that are really out there but that we have ourselves no inkling of. So nowadays, physicists believe in this stuff out there in the universe called dark matter. It's this kind of mysterious substance that makes up a majority of the mass in the universe. That is something which now exists in the understanding and in reality, but 100 years ago, people would have had no concept of this thing. At that time, dark matter existed only in reality, but not in the understanding, or at least not in the understanding of anybody around here. Okay, so that's the distinction between existence in the understanding and existence in reality. The simple gloss is, if you can think of something, it exists in the understanding. If it's really out there, it also exists in reality. Okay. So with those two basic ideas in hand, we can explore Anselm's argument. It is in premise form on the handout, which is associated with this lecture. So I would recommend taking a look at this handout as I talk. Hopefully, I'll also get some stuff on the screen here that illustrates the argument. But you can also look on the handout and type as you will go along if you want to take some notes. So here's the first premise. It's a 6-premise argument. 2 of the premises are conclusions of other premises, or 3 of them are conclusions of other premises, but we won't get too into the structure. So the first premise is that God is the greatest being you can think of. And that's just what I just said. That's just how Anselm defines God. And that's, as I also said, is a good definition of God if we're concerned with the God of classical theism, who is, after all, defined as an absolutely perfect being. So what's the greatest being you can think of? Well, an absolutely perfect one is the greatest being that you can think of. There's no way that an absolutely perfect being could be even better than being absolutely perfect. That's the best you can be. So okay, so that's a pretty easy premise to accept. The next premise is that either God exists in the understanding alone, or God exists both in the understanding and in reality. And this is also should be pretty unproblematic once you've understood the difference between existence in the understanding and existence in reality. What Anselm is saying is that, there's what you might think is that God is just something that exists in our mind, but God doesn't really exist out there in the world. This is what Anselm thinks an atheist would say this. An atheist is like, yeah, sure, God exists in our understanding. We could think of an absolutely perfect being, but there is no being really out there like that. There is no absolutely perfect being. It only exists in our understanding. That's what the atheist says. The theist, by contrast, says, oh, God exists not only in my understanding, I have this idea of God, but God also exists in reality. God's really out there. There really is an absolutely perfect being. Anselm assumes these are the only two possibilities, and that's a reasonable assumption given his way of thinking about this distinction between existence and understanding and existence and reality. So that premise, too, is pretty straightforward. Okay, so the third premise of Anselm's argument is really the crucial one. So Anselm says, look, which is better, existing in the understanding alone or existing in the understanding and in reality? Which kind of being is greater? One that exists in the understanding alone or one that also exists in reality? And he thinks, obviously, it's better to exist in reality and the understanding than it is to exist in the understanding alone. Here's what I think of it. So, I have a picture of a unicorn here. My daughter drew this picture of a unicorn. It's nice, huh? Yeah, okay, so here's a picture of a unicorn. It's great picture. Great unicorn. But here's what would be even greater is if this unicorn were also right outside in my yard. That would be greater. It'd be greater if the unicorn existed not only on the piece of paper, but also in the yard. If we had a unicorn, that'd be friggin' awesome. If we had a unicorn in our yard, that would be much greater than just having a unicorn on a piece of paper. So Anselm thinks that this is obviously correct, that it's greater to exist in reality than it is to exist in the understanding alone. Okay. Now, this premise, he doesn't defend this premise, and this premise is a place where, people might want to push back against the argument, especially when you see where it's going to go. But intuitively, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's, if you've got something great, it's even greater if it's real than if it's just imaginary, right? Wouldn't you rather have you can imagine a great meal, or you could actually eat a great meal, and which would be greater? Well, actually eating it, right? Generally speaking, than just imagining it. Okay, so how does this argument go now? We've got these first three premises, and the rest of it just follows from these three premises. The first is this: if God exists in the understanding alone, then there's an even greater being that you can think of, namely, one just like that, but who also exists in reality. Right? Okay, so if it's greater to exist in reality than it is to exist only in the understanding, then if God exists in the understanding alone, then there's actually a greater being, namely one that also exists in reality. But that means that God isn't actually the greatest being you could think of. Right? If God exists only in the understanding, then God's not the greatest being you can think of. But that's just how we've defined God. God has been defined as the greatest being you can think of. And so you can't say that God exists only in the understanding. You got to think God also exists in reality. And so that's the rest of the argument. So God doesn't exist in the understanding alone, because that if he did, there would be an even greater being. But there isn't one. And so the conclusion is that God exists in the understanding and reality. Okay, so there's the argument. It's kind of amazing. It's sort of magic. So we just define some terms. God is the greatest being that you can think of. We introduce this, pretty intuitive distinction between understanding and reality, and understanding and existence and the understanding and existence in reality. And we point out that it seems obviously better to exist in reality than to exist in the understanding alone. And from those three little ingredients, we get, boom, a proof of the existence of an absolutely perfect being. It's kind of it's amazing. As I said, most philosophers don't think it actually works, but it's very difficult to see what's wrong with it, and it's very hard to criticize it in a way that philosophers who have thought a lot about it will take on board. I'm going to talk about one really important famous objection to it, but first I just want to mention, now that we've seen the argument, why it's called the, quote, ontological argument. It's a bit of philosophical jargon. The word ontology comes from the Greek words that mean like the study of being or the study of essence. And the idea here is that the argument is supposed to prove that it's just part of God's very essence or very being to exist. So it's an argument that gives us a proof of the existence of God from just claims about the very being of God. Just the definition of God is one which implies that God must exist. So that's why it's called the ontological argument. Okay, so here's a really famous objection to the ontological argument. It was given by a monk named Gaunilo about 100 years after Anselm wrote, and it's good. It's a good objection. So here's what Gaunilo says. He says, imagine the greatest island that you can think of. You're doing it right now. Just imagine it. It's got perfect temperature, most phenomenal beaches, limitless supply of tropical fruit, whatever. Now ask yourself, does that island exist in reality? Or does it exist in the understanding alone? Well, if you say it exists in the understanding alone, then Gaunilo is going to come back at you and say, well, then there's an even greater island. That's not the greatest island you can think of. The greater island would be one that also existed in reality. And so it seems like the very same kind of argument that Anselm thought could prove the existence of God can also prove the existence of the greatest conceivable island. But that's crazy. That's nuts. There's no you obviously you can't just prove by sitting down and defining some terms and running through a little sequence of reasoning in your head. You can't prove that the greatest island the greatest conceivable island actually exists out there in reality. You can't do it. And so if there's something because this argument it seems like there's an argument that's just like the one that Anselm gave, which can also be given to prove something which we know can't be proven. That kind of indicates that there's something wrong with Anselm's argument. If you want, you can take a look in the textbook that the relevant passage from Gaunilo is included. It's on pages 12 and 13 of your textbook. So it's a problem for Anselm's argument. It seems to show that something has to be wrong with it. It's just silly to think that you can prove the existence of the greatest conceivable island. But if you can't do that, why can you prove the existence of the greatest conceivable being using Anselm's argument? Because it seems to be the very same kind of argument. Like I said, most philosophers agree there's something wrong with it. A lot of people think Gaunilo's objection is pointing to the fact that there's something really wrong with this argument. But there's very little agreement about what's wrong with it. It remains one of the most discussed arguments in the history of Western philosophy. And I should point out it has some contemporary defenders. At least much more sophisticated versions of the argument have some contemporary defenders. There's a pretty well-known American philosopher of religion named Alvin Plantinga, who is the author of a widely discussed, important contemporary version of the ontological argument. It's come a long way from Anselm's relatively straightforward presentation of the argument. If you think Anselm's difficult, wait till you try Plantinga. Nonetheless, it's important to point out that there are defenders of the argument. Although I think if you took a poll of philosophers, most of them would say, well, we're pretty sure there's something wrong with it. But it would also be pretty difficult to say what exactly is wrong with it. It seems like Anselm has given us a way via reflection alone to prove that there must be a greatest conceivable being, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, which of course would seem to be the same thing as proving the existence of God. So that's the ontological argument. I want you to now turn to go to Blackboard. There'll be a comprehension quiz on this argument, and once you pass that quiz, you can move on to the next lecture in this module, the final lecture in this module on the cosmological argument.